At my husband's funeral, as they lowered his casket, my grief was absolute. Then, a text from an unknown number lit up my phone with 6 words that turned my sorrow into pure, cold terror. I am still alive. Trust no one. My name is Lillian Vance, and I am 66 years old. The story I'm about to share with you isn't one I ever thought I'd tell. It's a story about how the deepest love can be poisoned by the darkest greed, and how a life built over 45 years can be shattered in a single moment. It began on the coldest day of my life, a day that had nothing to do with the late autumn chill whipping down from the Adirondacks. It was cold because I was standing in the Ironwood Hollow Cemetery, watching them lower my husband, my Silas, into the frozen ground. The air smelled of damp earth and the funereal sweetness of lilies. The pastor was speaking, his words about dust and ashes meant to be a comfort, but they were just a hollow drone against the roar of my own grief. Silas, my rock, my partner, since we were barely out of our teens, the man whose calloused hands could fix any engine but were gentle enough to tend to my rose bushes. 45 years of shared sunrises, quiet suppers, and the patient building of a life, all of it now confined to a polished oak box. As the coffin descended, my world wasn't just ending, it was about to be set on fire. It was in that moment of absolute finality that my phone buzzed in the pocket of my black wool coat. A single, silent vibration against my hip that would prove louder than any scream. I fumbled for it, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I thought it was another condolence message, another, "So sorry for your loss," from a distant cousin. My thumb swiped across the screen. An unknown number. And then I saw the words. 6 words that didn't just chill me to the bone, they fractured the very foundation of my reality, turning my grief into a terrifying, vertigo-inducing confusion. "I am still alive," it read. My heart didn't just stop. It felt like it was physically seized in an icy grip. I read the words again, my mind refusing to process them. A cruel prank. It had to be. Some horrible teenager playing a sick joke. But then the message continued, a second line appearing just below the first. "That's not me in the casket." The world went silent. The pastor's voice, the quiet sobs of my neighbor Estelle, the rustle of the wind in the bare maple trees, it all vanished. There was only the ringing in my ears and the impossible words glowing on the small screen. My breath hitched in my throat, a strangled, silent gasp. For a fleeting, insane second, a wild hope surged through me. Silas? But how? The hospital, the doctors. I saw him. I held his cold hand. My mind was a vortex of chaos. And then, the final, chilling sentence appeared, a command that turned my confusion into pure, cold dread. "Trust no one." The phone felt like it was burning my hand. I jammed it back into my pocket, my knuckles white. My gaze, as if pulled by an invisible string, shot across the grave to my sons. Julian, my eldest, stood tall and somber in his expensive city suit, his wife Portia clinging to his arm. Leo, my younger boy, stood beside him, his head bowed, dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief. They looked the part. 2 grieving sons, devastated by the loss of their father. But now, through the lens of those 6 terrifying words, I saw something else. The perfect stillness of Julian's grief, the mechanical, repetitive motion of Leo's dabbing. Their sorrow felt performed, rehearsed. The coldness I had mistaken for shock now felt like something else entirely. Something hollow. My Silas was gone. I knew that in my soul. So who was in that box, and who had sent me that message? The words, "Trust no one," echoed, and as I looked at the faces of the 2 boys I had raised, rocked to sleep, and loved more than life itself, a terrifying question began to form in the deepest, darkest corner of my heart. A question so monstrous I could barely let myself think it. What had they done? The reception back at our little house on Chestnut Street was a suffocating blur of casseroles, whispered condolences, and the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen where Silas and I had danced 1,000 times. Friends and neighbors I'd known my whole life drifted through the rooms, their faces etched with genuine sorrow. My best friend Estelle held my hand, her grip the only solid thing in a world that had turned to mist. But my mind wasn't there. It was locked on the message in my pocket and on the 2 men who shared my blood, moving through the familiar space of their childhood home like strangers. Trust no one. The words had become a lens, a filter through which I now saw everything. Julian, my firstborn, was the picture of solemn responsibility. He moved with a practiced grace, accepting sympathies, patting shoulders, ensuring everyone had a drink, but I watched his eyes. They weren't filled with memories, they were scanning, assessing. I saw him pull our family lawyer into the small den where Silas kept his fly fishing trophies. Through the cracked open door, I heard Julian's hushed, efficient tone. "Just want to make sure the paperwork for the estate is expedited, Bob. Dad would have wanted things settled quickly, no fuss." No fuss. He spoke of his father's life and legacy as if it were a business transaction to be closed. His grief was a well-tailored suit he wore for the occasion, but underneath, the ambitious, impatient man I'd watched him become was already moving on. His wife, Portia, stood by his side, a porcelain doll of a woman who looked at our worn furniture and faded wallpaper with a barely concealed horror, as if our 45 years of memories were simply in poor taste. Then, there was Leo, my sensitive boy. He was playing his part differently. He stood by the fireplace, a glass of Silas's best whiskey in his hand, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. He looked shattered, but it wasn't the clean break of sorrow. It was the splintered, jagged edge of pure anxiety. He drank too quickly. His laughter was a beat too loud when someone tried to share a fond memory of his father, and most telling of all, he wouldn't meet my eyes, not once. Every time my gaze drifted to him, he would find something fascinating in his glass, or on the ceiling, or out the window. He was a bundle of raw, frayed nerves, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't mourning his father, he was terrified of his mother. The maternal instinct is a powerful, blinding force. A part of my brain screamed at me that I was being cruel, that grief was making me paranoid. These were my children. The boys I had taught to tie their shoes, the teenagers whose first heartbreaks I had soothed with ice cream and patience. How could I even think such monstrous thoughts? But the message in my pocket felt like a cold, hard stone of truth. It wouldn't let me look away. It forced me to see. The confirmation came near the end of the evening, as the last of the guests were leaving. I was in the kitchen, rinsing a coffee cup, when Julian and Leo came in, thinking they were alone. Their voices were low, conspiratorial. "Did you call the insurance agent back?" Julian asked, his voice sharp with irritation. "He said the claim should be straightforward since it was an at-home accident," Leo mumbled, his words slightly slurred. "He just needs the final death certificate." Insurance. They were talking about the insurance claim. My husband had been in the ground for less than 6 hours, and they were talking about cashing in his life insurance policy. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers and shattered in the sink. They both jumped, turning to see me standing there. Julian's face was a mask of composure, but I saw a flicker of panic in Leo's eyes before he looked away. "Mom, you should be resting," Julian said smoothly, stepping forward to guide me out of the kitchen. His touch felt alien, his concern an insult. I pulled my arm away. For the first time, looking at them, I didn't see my sons. I saw two strangers with familiar faces, guarding a secret that was so terrible, it had turned my home into a crime scene and my heart into a hunting ground for a truth I was terrified to find. That night, after the last car had pulled away and the borrowed casserole dishes were stacked on the counter, the silence in our house was a physical presence. It was heavier than any sound. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of Silas's worn leather armchair, the place where he'd read the paper every evening for the last 30 years. The faint scent of him, a mix of motor oil, sawdust, and the Old Spice aftershave I bought him every Christmas still clung to the fabric. And in that suffocating quiet, the memories came flooding back, not as a comfort, but as a testament to everything that had been stolen. I met Silas Vance when I was 19. He'd just taken over his father's auto garage, a cavernous old building on the edge of town that always smelled of gasoline and potential. I'd brought in my father's beat-up Ford pickup, and he'd fixed a sputtering engine with a calm, quiet confidence that I found myself falling in love with before he'd even wiped the grease from his hands. We married a year later. Our life in Ironwood Hollow was never about money, because we never had much of it. It was built on a different kind of currency. Shared laughter over leaky pipes, the pride in a garden that fed us through the summer, the satisfaction of a day's hard work, and the unwavering certainty that we were a team. We raised our boys in that little 2-bedroom house, believing we were giving them the richest inheritance of all, the knowledge that they were loved. But maybe we were naive. We didn't see the seeds of discontent taking root. Julian, even as a child, had eyes that looked past the boundaries of our small town. He'd see the summer tourists drive through in their fancy cars and ask, "Dad, why don't we have a car like that? Why is your garage so old?" Silas would try to explain the dignity in his work, the freedom of being his own boss, of serving his community. But Julian didn't see dignity. He saw dirt under his father's fingernails. Leo, sweet and eager to please, idolized his older brother. He absorbed Julian's ambitions like a sponge, his discontent a pale reflection of his brother's burning resentment. The real change began when Julian went off to college in Syracuse. He found his world there, a world of slick real estate deals and people who measured a man's worth by the price tag on his suit. Leo followed him a few years later, and together they climbed. At first, we were so proud. Our sons, the first in our family to get degrees, were making something of themselves. But their success created a chasm between us that grew wider with every visit home. They'd pull up in a new BMW or a Lexus, talk about closing costs and capital gains, their words a foreign language in our simple living room. They started looking at us differently, their love slowly being replaced by a kind of patronizing pity. The day Julian brought Portia home for the first time was the day I knew we'd truly lost him. She walked into our home as if she were entering a dusty museum exhibit, her high heels sinking into the worn linoleum. She barely touched the pot roast I'd spent all afternoon cooking, the roast Julian used to call his favorite. They were a team, but their goals were different from ours. They saw our home not as a sanctuary of memories, but as a line item on a balance sheet. It's a strange and heartbreaking thing, watching the children you poured your entire soul into become people you no longer recognize. Have you ever felt that quiet disconnect when you look at someone you love and wonder where the person you once knew has gone? I'd be comforted to know I'm not alone, so please, let me know in the comments below. Sitting there alone in Silas's chair, the weight of it all pressed down on me. We hadn't lost our sons overnight. It was a slow, creeping erosion. We had lost them piece by piece, to ambition, to shame, and to the cold, hard logic of money. And I was beginning to understand, with a clarity that terrified me, that a man who is ashamed of where he comes from will one day do anything to erase it, even if it means erasing the people who gave him that life in the first place. The desire to erase your past is a dangerous thing. It starts with shame, then it morphs into impatience, and finally, it hardens into a cruel kind of logic. For my sons, Julian and Leo, their past was a modest little house and an old auto garage in Ironwood Hollow, and their parents were the aging caretakers of that past. We weren't just an inconvenience, we were an obstacle, and the pressure to remove that obstacle began about a year before Silas died. It started subtly, a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts. They'd visit from Syracuse, and Portia would run a delicate finger over a dusty bookshelf, her expression a masterclass in polite disgust. "Oh, Lillian," she'd sigh, "I don't know how you keep up with a place this old." Julian would talk about the booming real estate market, how homes in less desirable areas were finally seeing a bump in value. "It's a seller's market, Dad," he'd say, looking around our living room as if he were already calculating the square footage. "You and Mom are sitting on a nice little nest egg here." Silas would just grunt and turn a page of his newspaper. He knew exactly what Julian was doing. I tried to see it as concern, but it felt more like they were vultures circling. The campaign escalated one Sunday afternoon. They sat us down at our own kitchen table, the table where we'd celebrated their every birthday, and Julian, in his role as the self-appointed family CEO, laid out a glossy brochure for a place called Maple Creek Senior Living. "Look, Mom, Dad," he began, his tone patient, as if explaining a complex financial instrument to a child. "We've been thinking about your future. This house, it's a lot of upkeep. The garage is barely breaking even. You've worked hard your whole lives. You deserve to relax." He slid the brochure across the table. It showed smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard and taking watercolor painting classes. "If you sell the house and the garage, we figure you could clear around $150,000. That, plus your savings, you could live very comfortably at a place like Maple Creek." No more worrying about the roof leaking or the furnace breaking down in the middle of winter. I was speechless, the insult of it stealing my breath. They wanted to pack our lives into a single sterile room. But Silas was calm. He pushed the brochure back across the table without even looking at it. His voice was quiet, but it had the unyielding strength of forged steel. "This isn't a nest egg, Julian. It's our home," he said, his eyes fixed on his eldest son. "My father built that garage with his hands, and I rebuilt it with mine. It's seen this family through good times and bad. You don't liquidate a legacy. You don't put a price tag on a life." The rejection made them angry. The visits grew more tense. The phone calls became lectures. Then came the ultimate violation. A man in a suit knocked on our door one Tuesday. He was a realtor. "Here for the 2 p.m. appraisal," he said cheerfully. I stared at him, confused. "I think you have the wrong house," I told him. He checked his clipboard. "Vance residence? Scheduled by Mr. Julian Vance." My blood ran cold. They had gone behind our backs. Silas was in the garage, and when I told him, I saw a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, a deep, profound betrayal. He walked to the door, told the man politely but firmly that our home was not for sale, and shut the door. That night, he called Julian. I only heard Silas's side of it, his voice dangerously low. "Don't you ever disrespect your mother and me like that again? This is our home, our decision." "What do you mean? For our own good?" He was silent for a long time, listening. Then he said, "You are not to step in. Not now, not ever. We are your parents, not your clients." He hung up the phone, and when he turned to me, his face was pale. "They think we're old and foolish, Lil," he said, his voice heavy. "They think they have a right to our life." From that day on, a cold war began. We knew then that in our son's eyes we were no longer family to be cherished. We were a problem to be managed. A lockbox holding their inheritance, and they were getting tired of waiting for the key. After that last cold phone call with Julian, a tense silence fell between our two worlds. Weeks went by. The vibrant colors of fall in upstate New York faded to a brittle, uniform brown. Silas and I retreated into ourselves, into the familiar comfort of our routines, feeling like we were living in a fortress under siege. He spent more time in his garage, the clang of his tools a defiant rhythm against the quiet. I spent more time in my garden, pulling weeds with a vengeance, trying to root out the anxiety that had taken hold of my heart. We didn't talk much about the boys. The subject was a raw, open wound. We were waiting, though we didn't know for what. The end came on a Tuesday. It started like any other day. The sun was a pale wafer in a gray sky. I was in the kitchen, humming along to an old song on the radio, starting to peel potatoes for the shepherd's pie I was going to make for Silas's lunch. He'd kissed me goodbye an hour earlier, his lips tasting of coffee, and headed out to the garage to work on old Mr. Abernathy's Buick. It was all so terribly, tragically normal. The phone rang at 10:30. I wiped my hands on my apron and answered, expecting it to be Estelle. But it was Julian's voice, tight and controlled. "Mom," he said, and there was a strange lack of panic in his tone that chilled me. "You need to come out to the garage. Dad's had a fall, a bad one. I've already called an ambulance." The world tilted. I don't remember dropping the potato peeler or running out the back door. The short walk across the yard to the garage felt like miles. The big rolling door was open, and the sight inside will be burned into my memory until the day I die. Silas was lying on the concrete floor. A dark, glistening pool of motor oil was spreading out from under him, and his head was turned at an angle that was sickeningly wrong. Julian was standing a few feet away, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking calmly to the 911 operator. Leo was by the workbench, his back to me, his shoulders shaking. He looked like he was going to be sick. "He must have slipped on this oil patch, Mom," Julian said, pointing with his expensive leather shoe as if he were an expert witness at a trial. "He must have hit his head on the lift when he went down." It all made a horrible kind of sense. The garage floor was always a minefield of grease and oil. Silas was 67. Accidents happen. In the chaos and terror of that moment, with the siren wailing in the distance, I believed him. I had no reason not to. The days at the hospital were a blur of sterile smells, hushed doctors, and the relentless, rhythmic beeping of machines that were doing the breathing my husband no longer could. The diagnosis was a catastrophic brain injury. There was no hope. He was gone 3 days later. And then came the funeral and the message. Now, 2 days after we buried him, I sat in that same quiet kitchen where I'd been peeling potatoes, and I pulled out my phone. The cruel words still glowed on the screen. Was it all just a product of my grief-addled mind? Was I inventing suspicion where there was only tragedy? I was about to delete the message, to dismiss it as a sick prank, and try to salvage the memory of my sons, when the phone buzzed in my hand. My heart leaped into my throat. It was the same unknown number. This time, it wasn't a riddle. It was an instruction, a key. Check his workbench, under the loose floorboard. I stared at it, my breath catching. This was different. This wasn't a vague warning. This was specific. This person, whoever they were, knew things. They knew the garage. They knew Silas kept a floorboard under his main workbench, slightly loose to hide his best wrenches from apprentices. It was one of his little secrets. This was real. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with something else, a hot, fierce surge of adrenaline. I was done waiting. I was done grieving in the dark. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I put on the old coat Silas always wore when he worked in the yard, and for the first time since he died, I felt a flicker of his strength inside me. I was walking out to that garage, the place where my world had ended, not as a widow but as a hunter, and I was going to find the truth. The garage was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the November air outside, and everything to do with the fact that Silas's life had ended on its concrete floor. The moment I slid the heavy door open, the familiar scent of him, that mix of oil, steel, and sawdust, hit me like a physical blow. It was a tomb, but it was also a sanctuary. Every tool hung in its proper place on the pegboard, a silent army awaiting orders that would never come. His half-empty coffee mug sat on the workbench, a ghostly ring dried at the bottom, and there, in the middle of the floor, was the stain. A dark, ugly map of the moment my world came undone. I forced myself to look away from it, my mission a burning coal in my chest. My hands trembled as I knelt by the main workbench, the one his father had built 80 years ago. Under the loose floorboard, I ran my fingers over the worn wooden planks until I felt the slight give, the almost imperceptible seam that marked the hiding spot. It had been his little secret for decades. I had to fetch a flathead screwdriver from his toolbox to pry it open. In the dead silence of the garage, the groan of the old wood sounded like a scream. The cavity underneath was small and dark. My first thought was that the message was a lie, a cruel joke. But my fingers brushed against something that wasn't cold, hard steel. It was leather. I pulled it out. It was a small, black ledger, the kind he used to keep the garage's books in before I finally convinced him to use a computer a decade ago. Why was this here? Why was it hidden? I carried it over to the workbench, my heart hammering against my ribs. I switched on the small desk lamp, and a cone of yellow light cut through the gloom. I opened the ledger. The first half was filled with his strong, familiar handwriting notes about engine parts for a Chevy, invoices for tune-ups, reminders to order more filters. It was the mundane, beautiful script of his life's work. But then I flipped to the back. The last 20 pages were different. The writing was still his, but it was agitated, the letters sharp and hurried. These weren't business notes. They were diary entries, a chronicle of his growing fear. And then I found it. An entry from 3 months ago. Julian called again, pushing about the life insurance. He says the old policy, $25,000, is basically nothing in this day and age. Says he's worried about you, Lil, wants to make sure you're protected if something happens to me. It feels wrong. He's so insistent. My breath caught. I turned the page. Another entry, 2 weeks later. He came down from the city today, didn't even stay for dinner. Just brought the paperwork. A new policy. I looked at the number and my jaw nearly hit the floor. $250,000. $250,000. He called it a simple upgrade and said he'd handle the premiums for the first year to help out. How do you tell your son you don't trust him when he's looking you in the eye and telling you he's trying to protect your mother? I signed it. I feel like a damned fool. The ledger slipped from my fingers and landed on the workbench with a soft thud. $250,000. a number so large it felt like it belonged in another universe. It was the price of a life. His life. The motive wasn't just a vague suspicion anymore. It was a number, written in black ink in my husband's own worried hand. This was a receipt for a murder. As I stood there, shaking, a folded piece of paper slipped out from between the last pages of the book. It was a statement from a brokerage firm I didn't recognize, an investment account, and the balance at the top made me gasp. $75,000. Another secret. But this was Silas's kind of secret money he had quietly, patiently saved for us, for our future. And it was another fortune my sons had likely sniffed out. I closed the ledger. The grief in my heart was still there. A vast, cold ocean. But now, something else was rising from its depths. A hot, righteous rage. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a tragedy. This was an execution, planned and carried out for a cash payout. My husband hadn't fallen. He had been pushed, and I was standing in the very room where it happened, holding the proof. I hid the ledger deep in my cedar chest, under a pile of old quilts that smelled of my mother. The cold, hard proof felt like a cancerous growth I was trying to conceal, a truth too terrible to expose to the light. My mind was a maelstrom. For hours, I just sat in the living room, staring at the wall, trying to reconcile the image of the little boy who loved to build things with his father, with the man who had put a price tag on his father's life. The grief I felt was no longer just for my husband. It was for the sons I had apparently lost years ago without even realizing it. Just as the sun was setting, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the room, my phone rang. The shrill sound made me jump out of my skin. It was Leo. His voice was a raw, trembling whisper. "Mom?" he choked out. Can I come see you? Please, just us. Julian's not here." Against every warning bell that was screaming in my head, a traitorous flicker of hope ignited in my chest. Leo, my sensitive follower son. Maybe he was different. Maybe he was trapped, scared, consumed by a guilt he couldn't carry alone. The thought that I could salvage one of my children from this wreckage was a siren's call I was too weak to resist. "Come home, Leo," I said, my voice barely audible. He arrived an hour later, looking like a ghost. His face was pale and blotchy, his eyes swollen and red. He collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table, the very same spot where his father used to sit, and buried his face in his hands. The sobs that racked his body seemed to come from a place of genuine agony. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe. I put a hand on his trembling shoulder. "I can't do this anymore, Mom," he finally whispered, looking up at me, his eyes pleading. "I can't live with it." He then launched into a story, a carefully constructed narrative of coercion and fear. He told me Julian was in deep, terrifying debt to some dangerous people in the city. He said the whole idea, the insurance, the pressure to sell the house, it was all Julian. He painted his brother as a desperate, ruthless monster who had threatened him into compliance. "I swear to you, Mom, I never thought it would go this far," he cried, tears streaming down his face. "He said it was just about getting the money to pay them off. He swore no one would get hurt. When Dad fell, oh God, Mom, I saw it. Julian, he didn't help him right away. He just watched for a second. He was giving me a version of the truth, a half-truth designed to horrify me and cast him as a tragic, unwilling witness rather than an accomplice. My mother's heart ached for him, for the lost boy I saw sitting in front of me. Then, after he had me softened up with his tears and his twisted confession, he made his move. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. "Mom, we're in trouble," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Julian's creditors, they're going to come after the estate, after this house, after Dad's savings. They'll take everything." He opened the folder on the table. It was full of dense, intimidating legal documents. I talked to a lawyer, a good one, not one of Julian's sharks. He said the only way to protect what's yours is to put it all into a protected trust, just temporarily. It makes it untouchable. He slid a single sheet of paper towards me, and my eyes caught the words at the top. Durable power of attorney. "You just have to sign this, Mom," he said, his voice now steady, urgent. "It gives me temporary authority to move the assets into the trust. To save you. to finally do something right and protect you from him. He pushed a pen into my hand, and I almost did it. Oh God, I almost did it. Because in that moment, I wasn't a hunter for the truth. I was just a mother, desperate to believe that one of her sons was still worth saving. They say a mother's love is unconditional, but I wonder if that's true. Where is the line? When do you stop fighting for the person you wish they were and accept the monster they've become? That's a question I never thought I'd have to ask myself. If you've ever stood at a crossroads like that, forced to make a heartbreaking choice, I'd be grateful to hear your story. I took the pen, its cheap plastic cool against my skin. My hand was shaking as I moved the tip toward the signature line, the fate of my entire world resting on a single drop of ink. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the frantic beating of my own heart. The tip of the pen pressed against the paper, a tiny black dot of ink bleeding into the fiber. This was it, the crossroads. One signature and I could maybe, just maybe, pull my younger son back from the abyss. I could believe his story, believe in the power of my love to heal him, to save him from his brother's influence. I looked into Leo's eyes, searching for the little boy I used to know, the one who would bring me wilting dandelions from the yard as a gift. And for a second, I thought I saw him there, swimming in a sea of tears and regret. My hand started to move, to form the first letter of my name, and then my phone buzzed. It was lying face up on the table beside the cursed document, a silent witness to the entire scene. The vibration was short and sharp, an electric jolt that cut through the thick, cloying atmosphere of the kitchen. The screen lit up. We both saw it at the same time. A new message from that same, terrifyingly omniscient, unknown number. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. The words were stark, brutal, and absolute. It's a trap. Leo is with him. Sign nothing. Time stopped. In the space of a single heartbeat, the fragile, desperate hope I had allowed myself to feel didn't just die, it was executed. The image of the lost little boy in front of me shattered, and in his place, I saw a predator. The glacial clarity that washed over me was horrifying, but it was also a relief. The war in my heart was over. There was no one left to save. I slowly lifted the pen from the paper. I didn't look at the phone. I looked at my son, and I watched the mask of the grieving victim melt away from his face. The feigned tears seemed to evaporate. The pleading vulnerability in his eyes hardened into the cold, flat panic of a cornered animal. He saw the message. He knew the game was up. The shift was so sudden, so complete, it was like watching a demon shed its human skin. My voice, when I finally spoke, didn't tremble. It was a voice I didn't recognize, a voice that had been forged in the ice of this ultimate betrayal. A trust to protect me, Leo. I asked quietly, sliding the power of attorney document back to my side of the table. Or was it a trust to make it faster to pick the bones clean? For a moment, he just stared at me, his jaw working silently. The act was over, and what was left underneath was ugly. "You always were a sentimental old fool," he snarled, the change in his tone giving me whiplash. "Sitting here in this dump, clinging to your precious memories. Julian was right. You'd rather rot in this house than see it for what it is. A check that hasn't been cashed." The venom in his words was more painful than any physical blow could have been. He lunged for the papers, but I was faster. I snatched them off the table, and with a strength I didn't know I possessed, I ripped the entire stack in half, the sound of the tearing paper a final, definitive declaration of war. "Get out," I said, my voice still dangerously low. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His face was a twisted mask of fury and frustration. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're up against." "Oh, I think I'm just beginning to understand," I replied, my eyes locking onto his. "Now get out of your father's house." He left, slamming the back door so hard that a souvenir plate from Niagara Falls rattled on the wall. I stood there alone in the wreckage of my kitchen, in the ruins of my family, and I didn't cry. The time for tears was over. The last shred of maternal delusion had been burned away. My sons were not lost. They were the enemy. And they had just shown me, with sickening clarity, that they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But now, so would I. The morning after Leo's visit, the sun rose into a bruised-looking sky, and I knew I couldn't stay locked inside my house any longer. The ledger was a secret, the messages were a mystery, and Leo's venomous exit was a declaration of war. I was a 66-year-old widow, armed with fragments of a horrifying truth, facing an enemy who wore the faces of my own children. They were organized, they were ruthless, and as Leo's threat echoed in my ears, "You have no idea what you're up against," I realized I needed to find out. My next step was clear. I had to go to the police. In a town as small as Ironwood Hollow, this is no small decision. Everybody knows everybody. Frank McGregor, our chief of police, had played poker with Silas on the first Thursday of every month for the last 20 years. His wife belonged to my gardening club. Going to him with a suspicion about my own sons felt like setting off a bomb in the center of our tiny, interconnected world. But the fear of what my sons might do next was greater than my fear of town gossip. The police station was a small brick building next to the post office, a place that usually dealt with nothing more serious than a lost dog or a kid on a skateboard. When I walked in, Frank came out from his office, his face immediately softening with concern. "Lillian," he said, his voice a warm, familiar rumble. "It's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. How are you holding up?" "I'm doing, Frank. Just doing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was hoping you could help me with something. For the insurance company, they need a copy of the official police report on Silas's accident. It was a lie, a pretext, but it was the only way I knew to start." Frank's demeanor shifted instantly. It was subtle, but I saw it. The warmth in his eyes flickered. He cleared his throat and busied himself with a stack of papers on his desk. "Of course, Lillian. Let me see what I've got. Coffee?" He was stalling. A man I'd known for 30 years was suddenly avoiding my gaze. After a few minutes of shuffling through a filing cabinet, he pulled out a remarkably thin folder and laid it on the counter between us. "Here it is," he said. I read it. It was less than a page long. It stated the facts as reported by Julian. Victim found by son, apparent slip and fall on an oil spill. Coroner's initial finding consistent with head trauma from a fall. Case closed. It was all neat, tidy, and completely devoid of the horror of that day. "Frank," I said, pushing the report back towards him and looking him straight in the eye. "You knew Silas. You know how he was in that garage. He was as sure-footed as a mountain goat. He could walk through that place blindfolded. This doesn't feel right to you, does it?" He let out a long, heavy sigh and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked around the empty station, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Off the record, Lil? No, it doesn't." He confessed that the first paramedic on the scene, a young guy, had noted in his initial log that the lividity, the way blood settles in a body after death, seemed a little off for the position Silas was found in. He also said the hospital's first tox screen flagged an unidentifiable chemical marker, but it was quickly dismissed as a contaminated sample. "I wanted to poke around," Frank said, his voice full of regret. "But the next morning I got a call from the county sheriff's office, a captain I've never even met. He told me it was a tragic, straightforward accident and that my department's resources were better spent elsewhere." He wasn't finished. An hour later, Julian's lawyer called, said the family was devastated and any further investigation would just cause you unnecessary pain. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. This wasn't just my sons. They had used their money and their connections to pull strings, to apply pressure from above, to ensure that no one asked any uncomfortable questions. They had built a wall around their crime. Frank, a good man, had been professionally and politely told to stand down. It's a terrifying thing to realize the systems designed to protect you can be manipulated by those with power and influence, leaving you utterly alone. When the official doors are closed to you, sometimes the only path forward is the one you forge yourself. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight against the official story to get to the truth? Your strength gives others strength, so please, share your experience. I left the station that day with a cold knot of dread in my stomach. The law in Ironwood Hollow had been bought and paid for. My sons were more powerful than I had ever imagined. And the anonymous messenger was the only ally I had left in the world. I drove home from the police station feeling like the last door in the world had been bolted shut in my face. The cold reality of my situation settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. It was a conspiracy. My sons hadn't just committed a crime, they had sanitized it, wrapped it in legal tape, and used their influence to make the official record reflect their fiction. Frank's whispered confession had confirmed my worst fears. The system wasn't just failing me, it had been actively steered away from the truth. I was completely, terrifyingly alone. That evening, the house felt less like a home and more like a cage. Every shadow seemed to mock me. Every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a footstep. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see Julian's sleek, dark sedan parked down the street, watching me. Leo's parting threat, "You have no idea what you're up against," played on a loop in my head. He was right. I was a 66-year-old widow with a hidden ledger and a few cryptic text messages, up against two men who could make police chiefs stand down and lawyers close ranks. What chance did I possibly have? For the first time since this nightmare began, despair began to set in, a cold, creeping fog that threatened to extinguish the last embers of my resolve. I sat in Silas's armchair, the ledger on my lap, feeling the crushing weight of my own helplessness. Maybe my sons were right. Maybe I was just a sentimental old fool. Maybe the smartest thing to do, the safest thing to do, was to let it go. To mourn my husband, accept the lies, and let them have their blood money. At least I would be left alone. At least I would be safe. The thought was a bitter poison, a surrender that felt like a second death. I closed my eyes, the exhaustion of the past week washing over me, and for a moment, I gave up. And then, as if summoned by my surrender, my phone chimed on the end table. My eyes shot open. The sound was soft, but it cut through the silence of the room like a rifle shot. I stared at the phone, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It had been days since the last message, the one that had saved me from Leo's trap. I had started to think my mysterious ally had vanished, that I had been left to fight this battle alone. With a trembling hand, I reached for it. The screen was bright in the dim room, an unknown number, and the longest message yet. It wasn't a clue this time, or a warning. It was an invitation, an endgame. Corner Cafe, Oakhaven. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Sit at the back booth. Ask the waitress for David. Come alone. It's time you knew everything. Oakhaven was the next town over, a 20-minute drive. A place where I wouldn't be recognized. A public place, but a specific booth. A name, David. The message was a lifeline thrown into my sea of despair. My mysterious guardian angel was finally stepping out of the shadows. This was it. The moment of truth. Every instinct screamed that it was a risk. This could be an elaborate trap set by my sons, a way to lure me out of my home. But as I read the words again, a different instinct took over, the one that had been screaming at me since the funeral. The one that told me the truth was out there, and this was my only chance to grab it. The despair I had felt moments before evaporated, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I wasn't going to surrender. I wasn't going to let them win. My husband, my Silas, deserved more than that. He deserved justice, and I was the only one left to get it for him. They had underestimated me. They saw me as a grieving, fragile old woman, easily manipulated and easily discarded. They had forgotten that I was Silas Vance's wife, and I was about to remind them what that meant. I stood up, the ledger clutched in my hand. Tomorrow I would drive to Oakhaven. I would walk into that cafe, and I would ask for David. I didn't know if I was walking toward salvation or into the lion's den, but it didn't matter. Either way, I was done being a victim. I was done being afraid. Tomorrow I was walking into a fight. The 20-mile drive to Oakhaven the next day was the longest of my life. Every set of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a threat. Every turn in the winding country road a potential ambush. I clutched the steering wheel with white knuckles, my husband's ledger a solid, reassuring weight on the passenger seat beside me. I was driving toward a complete unknown, a stranger named David who held the key to either my salvation or my destruction. By the time I pulled into a parking spot across from the corner cafe, my nerves were frayed to a breaking point. The cafe was exactly what its name suggested. A slice of small-town America, with red vinyl booths, the clatter of silverware, and the rich, comforting smell of brewing coffee. It was so normal, so mundane, It felt completely at odds with the terrifying purpose of my visit. I slid into the back booth as instructed, the one with a small crack in the vinyl, and ordered a black coffee I knew I wouldn't be able to drink. When the waitress came, I took a deep breath and asked the question that felt like a password to a secret society. "I was supposed to meet someone here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Is David working today?" The waitress, a woman with kind, tired eyes, gave me a small, knowing smile. "He's been expecting you," she said. "He'll be right over." A minute later, a man approached my table. He wasn't what I expected. There was no trench coat, no gruff, world-weary expression. He was a man in his late 40s, of Asian descent, dressed in a simple, neat button-down shirt. He had a calm, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to see everything. He slid into the booth across from me and extended a hand. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice low and steady. "My name is David Chen. Thank you for coming. I'm so sorry for your loss." My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Are you the one?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The messages?" He nodded slowly. "I am. I'm a private investigator." The words hung in the air between us. A private investigator. The mystery was finally beginning to unravel. My mind raced. Who would hire him? The police? A concerned friend? But my next question was the only one that truly mattered. "Who hired you, Mr. Chen?" He paused, his gaze full of a deep, professional compassion. He seemed to understand that the words he was about to say would change my world forever. "Your husband, Mrs. Vance," he said gently. "Silas hired me 4 months ago." The air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. Silas. My quiet, unassuming husband had hired a private investigator. The secret he had been carrying, the worry I had seen in his eyes during those last few months, it was all so much deeper and darker than I had ever imagined. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled me, crashed over me all at once. Profound shock that he had hidden this from me, a deep, aching grief for the fear he must have been living with, and an overwhelming, heartbreaking wave of pride. My husband, my Silas, had not been a blind victim. He had been a soldier, preparing for a war he knew was coming. He saw the signs, David continued, as if reading my thoughts. The pressure to sell the house, Julian's sudden interest in the insurance. He knew something was wrong. He wanted me to investigate his own sons, to find out what kind of trouble they were in. He was trying to protect you. Tears I didn't know I had left began to well in my eyes. Then, I remembered the first, most confusing message. But the message, at the funeral, I stammered. It said he was still alive. David leaned forward, his expression intent. That was his idea, Mrs. Vance. It was our contingency plan, a code. He made me promise. He said, "David, if something happens to me, and you suspect for a second that it wasn't an accident, you send that message to Lillian immediately. You tell her I'm still alive." He grabbed my arm when he said it. His eyes were fierce. He said, "It won't mean my body is still alive. It will mean my plan is still alive. It will mean she has to fight." That message was your husband's last testament, Mrs. Vance. It was his way of reaching out from beyond the grave to tell you that he had a plan, and that you were now the one who had to see it through. The waitress came and refilled my coffee cup, but I didn't notice. The whole world had narrowed to the space in that booth. The cryptic message that had haunted me was not a riddle, it was a legacy, a call to arms from the man I loved. He hadn't just died, he had passed a torch, and I was just beginning to feel the heat. I sat there in the cracked vinyl booth of the corner cafe, the ordinary world of clinking coffee cups and quiet chatter fading into a distant hum. My husband had armed me from his grave. The knowledge was a shield, but it was also a burden of impossible weight. David Chen watched me, his expression patient, allowing me a moment to absorb the seismic shift in my universe. Finally, he spoke, his voice pulling me back from the edge. "Silas wanted you to have more than just a plan, Mrs. Vance," he said softly. "He wanted you to have the truth. All of it. I have to warn you, what I'm about to show you is difficult." He placed a slim laptop on the table between us and opened it. The screen flickered to life. "Silas was worried they might do something in the garage," David explained. He had me install 2 microcameras a few months back. Their motion, activated. One is disguised as a screw head on the main support beam, the other is in an old, dead smoke detector on the ceiling. He clicked a file, and a video player opened. This is from the morning he died. The footage was grainy, silent, and in black and white, which somehow made it even more sinister. It was like watching a ghost story, only the ghosts were my own family. The timestamp in the corner showed 10:14 a.m. I saw my Silas, my husband, walk through the frame, carrying a heavy wrench. He was alive, healthy. He moved with the easy, familiar grace of a man who had spent a lifetime in that space. He disappeared into the small office in the back. A minute later, Julian entered the frame from the main door. He moved with a chilling purpose. He looked around, then walked over to the oil disposal drum. He picked up a wide, shallow pan full of used motor oil thick and black as tar and walked to the center of the floor. And then I watched my firstborn son, the baby I had nursed at my breast, deliberately and methodically tilt the pan and pour a large, slick pool of oil directly in the path between the office and the main workbench. He didn't spill it, he placed it. It was an act of engineering, a murder weapon being set. I must have made some sound, a strangled gasp, because David paused the video. "There's more," he said gently. He played a second clip from the other camera, time-stamped 10:11 a.m., just 3 minutes earlier. It showed Leo. My younger son walked over to the official security camera system Silas had installed years ago, a box high on the wall. He reached up, his face a mask of nervous guilt, and unplugged a single, crucial wire. He had disabled the alibi, the official record, before his brother set the trap. My stomach churned. This was not a crime of passion. This was a premeditated execution. But the final proof, the thing that would shatter the last molecule of my maternal denial, was yet to come. David closed the video player and opened an audio file. "Silas had me place a bug on your landline," he said. He was worried about the calls Julian was making. "This is from a week before the accident. It's Julian and Leo." He pressed play. Their voices, so familiar and yet so monstrous, filled the small space. "Julian, the oil slick is the only way. It's clean, it's untraceable. An old man, a greasy garage floor. No one will ever question it for a second." Leo, his voice thin, reedy. "Are you sure? Are you sure it'll be enough? What if he just breaks a hip or something?" Julian, a sigh of pure, cold irritation. "Leo, don't be an idiot. The lift is right there. We'll make sure he hits his head. Just be ready to make the call to 911 and play the part. Can you handle that? Or are you going to fall apart like you always do?" David played one last clip. It was from the night before, right after Leo had stormed out of my house. It was Julian, his voice a furious snarl. "She knows, the old fool, she knows something. I told you your pathetic act wouldn't work. Forget it. We move to plan B. First thing in the morning, you're calling Dr. Albright. You tell him her paranoia is out of control. We're getting her declared incompetent by the end of the month, one way or another. We are not losing that money." The audio clicked off. I sat back, the vinyl of the booth sticking to my skin. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for hope. There's a profound, soul-altering difference between suspecting a terrible truth and seeing it with your own eyes. Once you witness the monster without its mask, you can never unsee it. Have you ever been confronted with a piece of evidence? A hard, ugly fact that changed your entire world? Knowing that others have walked through that fire and survived can be a strange and powerful comfort. The cheerful noise of the cafe was an insult to the horror that now lived inside me. I finally had the truth, the whole, monstrous, unforgivable truth, and I knew what I had to do. The laptop screen went black, but the images and sounds were seared into my brain, a permanent, horrific scar on my soul. The friendly, mundane chatter of the corner cafe swirled around me, a surreal counterpoint to the monstrous truth that now sat between me and David Chen. For a long moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I was frozen by the sheer, calculated evil of it all. Julian's cold voice, Leo's nervous complicity, the visual of my husband's death trap being laid, it was all too much. David simply sat in silence, giving me the space to process the unthinkable. Finally, I took a deep, shuddering breath, and the ice that had been forming in my veins for weeks solidified into a diamond-hard resolve. I looked at David, and the grieving widow was gone. All that was left was the warrior Silas had entrusted with his final mission. "What's next?" I asked, my voice as steady and cold as a tombstone. "Where do we take this?" "Not to Chief McGregor," David said immediately, confirming my fears. "He's a good man, but he's outgunned. Your sons used their lawyer and their city connections to pressure the county sheriff's office to shut him down. If we go back to him, word will get to your sons in minutes. They could destroy evidence, flee. We can't risk it." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "We go over their heads. We take this directly to the New York State Police. I've already looked into it. The barracks in Clifton Park has a Bureau of Criminal Investigation unit. They have the jurisdiction and the resources, and they don't answer to the local good old boy network. I've got a name, a senior investigator named Russo. She has a reputation for being tough and thorough." The drive to the state police barracks was nothing like the nervous journey to the cafe. This time, David drove. I sat in the passenger seat, Silas's ledger in my lap, the laptop containing the evidence in a bag at my feet. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it had been surpassed by a powerful, righteous sense of purpose. I felt my husband's presence with me then, not as a ghostly memory, but as a silent partner in the passenger seat. His quiet strength, his unshakable sense of right and wrong, it flowed through me. I was no longer just Lillian Vance, the grieving widow. I was the executor of his will, the instrument of his justice. The barracks was an imposing, modern brick building, a world away from the sleepy little station in Ironwood Hollow. It felt serious, official, and impartial. Investigator Russo was a woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a firm handshake that spoke of competence. She led us to a small, windowless interview room. There was no small talk, no drawn-out condolences, just a simple, "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Vance, please, tell me what you have." For the next hour, we did. I started, my voice clear and steady as I recounted the story from the beginning, the funeral, the first cryptic message, Leo's manipulative visit, and my conversation with the compromised Chief McGregor. Then, David took over. He laid out his own investigation, explaining how Silas had hired him, the purpose of the code, and the technical details of the surveillance. Finally, he opened the laptop. He played the videos first. Investigator Russo watched the grainy footage without a flicker of emotion on her face, but I saw her jaw tighten as Julian poured the oil onto the garage floor. Then, David played the audio files. As my sons' voices filled the sterile room, coldly planning their father's death and my subsequent disposal, a visible shift occurred. The professional detachment in Investigator Russo's eyes hardened into a look of grim, focused intensity. When the last recording clicked off, she was silent for a long moment. "They bribed a doctor too, didn't they?" she asked. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "To sign off on the death certificate, we'll get him." She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of compassion in her eyes. "Mrs. Vance, I know this has been an unimaginable ordeal, but I want to assure you, it's over. We're taking over this case as of this moment." She picked up her phone. "I'm getting a judge on the line to sign the warrants now. With this evidence, there won't be any delay. We'll move on them at dawn." Leaving the barracks as the sun began to set, the sky ablaze in streaks of orange and purple, I felt the first true exhale of breath I'd taken in weeks. The immense weight on my shoulders hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. I had passed the torch, just as Silas had intended. The slow, grinding wheels of justice had begun to turn. The quiet of Ironwood Hollow was about to be shattered, and my sons had no idea that their mother, the sentimental old fool, was the one who had just lit the fuse. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Silas's armchair, the ledger in my lap, and waited for the dawn. With every passing hour, my resolve hardened. The woman who had wept at my husband's grave was gone, replaced by a vessel for his justice. At 6:15 a.m., just as the first gray light of morning began to creep over the hills, my phone rang. It was Investigator Russo. Her voice was calm and professional. "We have them in custody, Mrs. Vance. Both arrests were made without incident. and that was it. The war my sons had started was, for them, already over. The news ripped through Ironwood Hollow like a flash flood. Patricide. It was a word that didn't belong in our quiet little town, a biblical, monstrous crime that was now attached to the Vance family name forever. The next few months leading up to the trial were a special kind of hell. The town was a hornet's nest of whispers and speculation. Some people looked at me with pity, others with a kind of morbid curiosity. A few, I'm sure, saw me as a Medea-like figure, a mother who had turned on her own sons. My friend Estelle was my rock, my shield against the storm, bringing me groceries so I wouldn't have to face the stares at the market. David Chen and the district attorney's office guided me through the legal labyrinth, preparing me for the ordeal to come. The day the trial began, the county courthouse was a circus. News vans from as far as Albany and Syracuse were parked outside. The courtroom was packed to the rafters with the curious and the concerned. As I walked down the center aisle, supported by Estelle and David, a hush fell over the room. I didn't look at the faces in the crowd. I looked only at the empty witness stand, my own personal summit to be climbed. Then, they brought them in. I hadn't seen them since their arrests. The sight of them stole the breath from my lungs. Gone were the expensive suits and confident smirks. Dressed in orange prison jumpsuits, they were diminished, stripped of their power. Julian, my handsome, ambitious Julian, was gaunt and pale, his face a mask of cold, defiant fury. He met my gaze for a fraction of a second, and his eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. He blamed me, not for what he had done, but for getting caught. And Leo. My God, Leo was a ghost. He was a broken, shuffling wreck of a man, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. He never once looked up from the floor. In that moment, I felt a pang of the most profound and painful pity, not for the men they were, but for the innocent little boys they had murdered within themselves long ago. The trial itself was a methodical demolition of their lies. The prosecutor was brilliant, a sharp, compassionate woman who laid out the evidence brick by painstaking brick. She presented Silas's ledger. She put David Chen on the stand to explain the secret investigation and the meaning of the coded message. But the moments that shattered the courtroom's composure were the ones I had already witnessed in the cafe. First, the video. A collective gasp went through the gallery as the jury watched Julian calmly pour the oil on the floor. Several jurors looked from the screen to his impassive face and back again, their expressions hardening. Then came the audio recordings. The prosecutor played them over the courtroom's sound system, and the silence was absolute, sacred, and terrifying. The casual, callous voices of my sons, plotting their father's death as if they were discussing a business merger, filled every corner of the room. When they heard the recording of Julian and Leo planning to have me committed, a woman in the back of the courtroom began to sob uncontrollably. The jury didn't even need to deliberate. Their faces were carved from stone. The verdict came back in under 2 hours. I sat straight and tall as the jury foreman stood, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded the paper. In the matter of the state versus Julian Vance, he read, his voice ringing with grim finality, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A tremor went through Julian, the first crack in his icy facade. On the charge of murder in the first degree, against the defendant Leo Vance, we find the defendant and guilty. Leo collapsed in his chair, his shoulders finally surrendering to the sobs he'd been holding back for months. The judge, a man with a face like a tired hawk, proceeded immediately to sentencing. He looked down at my sons, his eyes filled with a weary disgust. I find no mitigating circumstances here, he said, his voice like gravel. Only a bottomless pit of greed and a betrayal of the most sacred trust that exists. I sentence you both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down with a crack that sounded like the breaking of the world. Justice is a strange and hollow thing. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't heal the wounds. Sometimes it's just a quiet, clean silence after a long and brutal storm. It's the moment you realize you can finally, after so long, breathe again. If you've ever had to fight a long battle for a just outcome, you know that quiet peace is the only real prize. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright, cold light of day, I felt no joy, no triumph, just the profound, somber, and deeply peaceful emptiness of a promise kept. After the gavel fell, a strange and profound silence descended upon my life. The storm was over. The reporters left. The town's whispers faded back into the quiet hum of everyday life. I was left alone in the house on Chestnut Street, surrounded by the ghosts of what had been, and I was left with the money, all of it, the insurance payout of $250,000, the $75,000 from Silas's secret savings, and after a few months, another $150,000 from the sale of the house and the garage, two places I could no longer bear to step foot in. It all added up to $475,000, the exact price of my husband's life and my children's souls. The money sat in a bank account, and I couldn't touch it. Every dollar felt radioactive, tainted with blood and betrayal. To use it on myself to buy a new car or take a trip felt like letting them win, like accepting the spoils of their horrific victory. The money was a monument to their crime, and I couldn't tear it down, so I had to find a way to rebuild it into something else. The idea came to me one rainy afternoon as I was sorting through a box of Silas's old account books from the garage. I saw page after page of his familiar, strong handwriting, and next to many names, a small note. Paid late, or no charge, fix for free. I remembered how he'd quietly replaced the tires on a widow's car and told her not to worry about it, how he'd let families pay their bills off a few dollars at a time when the local mill had shut down. My Silas, in his quiet way, had always been a protector of the vulnerable in our community. He understood that a person's dignity was worth more than any invoice. That's when I knew what I had to do. This wasn't my money, it was his, and I had to use it the way he would have. I called David Chen. I called the district attorney who had prosecuted the case. I told them my idea. At first they were hesitant, urging me to keep some for myself, for my own future. But my mind was made up. My sons had tried to turn my husband's legacy into a cash payout. I was going to turn that cash back into a legacy, a real one. 6 months later, the Silas Vance Legacy Foundation was born. I used every single penny of that $475,000 to establish a nonprofit organization with a single, clear mission: to provide free legal, financial, and investigative support to elderly individuals facing financial abuse and exploitation from their own families. I bought a small, modest office building in downtown Ironwood Hollow. David Chen agreed to sit on the board and consult on cases that required investigation. We hired a compassionate young lawyer who specialized in elder law. My life, which had become so empty, was suddenly full of purpose. The long, silent days were now filled with phone calls, paperwork, and meetings. I was no longer just Lillian Vance, the widow. I was Lillian Vance, the advocate. The first case we took was a woman from a nearby town named Mary. Her son was trying to have her declared incompetent so he could sell her family farm to a developer. Her story was a chilling echo of my own. We provided her with our lawyer, who fought him in court. David found evidence that the son had a massive gambling debt. We won. Mary kept her farm. When she came to my office and hugged me with tears in her eyes, saying, "You saved my life," I felt a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy. That is how my husband stays alive. Not as a ghost in a quiet house, but as an active force for good in the world. His integrity, his quiet strength, his innate desire to protect the good and the vulnerable, it all lives on in the work we do. They say the best revenge is living well, but I think the truest victory is turning the weapon that was used to harm you into a shield for others. That's how we take back our story. My journey began with the darkest of betrayals, but I refuse to let that be the final chapter. If this story has moved you, please consider looking into resources for elder protection in your own community. A single phone call, a single act of checking on a vulnerable neighbor can be the message that saves a life. The ultimate irony is that the money my sons killed for is now the very thing that stops men like them every single day. Their greed has become my weapon for good, and that is a legacy worth fighting for. It's been 5 years since the trial. I live in a small cottage on the other side of town now, with a little garden out back where I grow the most beautiful roses. The silence that surrounds me these days is different from the one that haunted my old house. This silence is peaceful. It's the sound of a life that is quiet but not empty. I sometimes receive letters from the prison. One from Julian, full of blame and rage. Several from Leo, incoherent ramblings of guilt and paranoia. I don't read them anymore. I mourn the little boys I raised. I will always miss them. But the men they became are strangers to me now, ghosts from a different life. My anger has long since faded, replaced by a deep, sorrowful pity for the richness they threw away for something so worthless. My family now is the one I've built. It's Estelle, who brings me soup every Tuesday. It's David Chen, who still calls to check in, his professional duty having long ago blossomed into a genuine friendship. It's the volunteers at the foundation, and the faces of the people we've helped, their gratitude a warmth that fills the spaces my sons left behind. I have learned that family isn't about the blood you share, but about the loyalty and love you earn. Every Sunday morning, I cut a few of my best roses and drive to the cemetery. I sit by Silas's grave, and I tell him everything. I tell him about the farm we saved, about the woman we helped stand up to her predatory nephew, about how his name has become a beacon of hope in our small corner of the world. I know he can't hear me, but in the gentle breeze that rustles the leaves of the old oak tree nearby, I feel his approval. I feel his peace. The pain of his loss will never vanish completely, but it has changed. It is no longer a gaping wound, but a quiet, clean scar, a reminder not of the horror of his death, but of the strength of his life. He saw the darkness coming and lit a candle. My only job was to keep it from being extinguished, and in doing so, I found my own way back to the light. His death was not in vain. His love was not in vain. It lives on,